again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. A good topic? Let's do it. What's the most effed up story you've ever heard? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. My barber for years, a Vietnamese American who gained refugee status during the boat people era, out of the blue, while cutting my hair, told me a story about how pirates took one of her sisters as a payment for the family's safe passage from Thailand to Hong Kong. They never found out what became of her, but the family never stopped looking. The story was told in what appeared to me the most nonchalant yet heartbreaking way, as if she was merely wondering out loud. This was some teen years ago. Every so often I find myself thinking about the scenario, and the type of strength it must have taken to endure and survive such a situation. My ex-wife's aunt came home after work and saw her husband sitting on a stump, leaning on an axe in the backyard. She assumed he was taking a break from chopping firewood, so she made coffee. She took it out to him and found out he had slipped. The axe cut his leg. He sat on the stump and he bled out. The only thing propping him up was the axe. He had been dead since about noon. The story has never left my brain. Late 80s, early 90s, in a small village in the northwest of England, we had a milkman groceries dude who'd been our milkman in the surrounding area for years. Loads of lads, including my eldest brother, 10 years older than me at the time, had done milk round shifts with him, cash in hand now and then. Stopped doing it because he was a bit of a strange man, and my parents and other parents in the village were a bit concerned about his general demeanor, but, you can't just vilify someone on a bad vibe. During the end of his tenure at the local dairy, me and my two mates were playing footy using our front drive as a goalpost in our street. I think we were about 11 at the time. He pulled up and was doing his money collection round. My parents weren't home, but we were playing heads and volleys in front of my house. He says something along the lines of how he was going back to the dairy. My parents' house was the last stop, and would we and my two mates like a lift there and back on the back of the little electric milk float, a la Pat Mustard for any farther Ted fans. And, being stupid kids we thought the dairy was around the corner. It was about 25 minutes away, though, through country lanes that we'd never been down before. Got to the dairy thinking he'll continue on his rounds and drop us off where he picked us up from. Got there, to the dairy, said he'd clocked off for the day, made us get in the back of his weird estate car with blankets on the back, really strange and quiet. We were quite scared. Dropped us off safe and sound, right outside the house anyway. Our parents collectively went mental. I remember us all saying, "He's a weirdo pedo, that fella," and kind of being told often, "You can't ban that word around, it can ruin someone's life," accusations like that. Although, all our parents had a huge go at him anyway, and said obviously that never ever do that again. My dad was fuming, thought he was going to twat him. Never saw him again. A few years later, he was on the front page of all local newspapers for R-ing and S.A.ing young boys dating back from the 70s. He went to prison for a long time, probably dead now, with a bit of luck. I drink Cravendale filtered nowadays. My best friend, when we were 22, got shot in the head. Someone broke into her house, put a pillow over her head, and shot her while she was sleeping in her bed. She survived, but had brain damage. Then 30 years later, she was sleeping in her bed, a manufactured home, and an 18-wheeler ran over her and killed her. Apparently, the driver had stolen the truck and was on the run from the police. He jumped out of the truck and kept going right over her. When I was living in Virginia, I had a buddy who was an EMT. He responded to a call of somebody going into anaphylactic shock. When they got him to the hospital, they discovered a rash on his lower back and backside. See, he somehow got his neighbor's German Shepherd to rectally violate him, but it turns out he was allergic to the dog. I won't say my relation to this story, as I don't want my identity to be obvious. Basically, I knew a 15-year-old girl who gave birth recently. It was found that the boy had crabs, a fatal disease. Thus, the baby died shortly after birth. As with many diseases, crabs is contained in a recessive gene. There must be two carriers to have a child with that disease. The girl's boyfriend isn't a carrier, though. Her dad is. And that's not the worst part. The baby is a result of 11 years of R. He had been R'ing his daughter since she was 4 years old. When this information became widely known, her aunt responded to the situation by saying, "That little whore should have kept her mouth shut instead of running the family's reputation." I once was on a beach taking photos of surfers, and one of them wanted to buy some shots of himself. Well, I got them printed up, and when I tried to get a hold of the dude, I found out he had done a bunch of hallucinogens and killed his roommate and fed their friend's heart to his dog and supposedly ate some himself. I do not have any relation with it, but I do know of someone involved in the story. In a Catholic church hospital in Spain during the 30s, all the way up to the 70s, the only doctor and nuns working there used to help give birth to pregnant women, but around 1/4 of the women gave birth to an already dead baby. Turns out the doctor and nuns had a long-dead, freezed newborn stored in a freezing chamber, which they used to show those women, telling them their baby had died in the process. All of this while taking away their alive and healthy babies, so they could sell the babies to wealthy families or orphanages. I don't want to imagine the pain of being a mother, thinking you've lost your baby, only for it to be sold to another couple of parents. I mean, that's an absolute horrible story, and a terrible tragedy to all those poor women. That being said, it would be a very interesting movie, but maybe like the revenge angle, going after the doctors and nuns and nurses. So a friend is an EMT. He was once called to a traffic accident on a mountain pass. Some guy had just gotten his new superbike and wanted to try it out. The mountain pass roads are often long, straight, and without traffic. They guesstimate that he was somewhere north of 300 kilometers an hour, 186 mph. But no traffic also means more wildlife. He hit a moose that was just pieces left. They just had to bring everything to the morgue and sort it there. So we used to have a classmate in first grade. He died in a car accident along with his mother right in front of our school because of a drunk woman. His body was found in front of the school gate. Luckily, we weren't the ones who found his corpse because it happened on a weekend, but still, everyone knew what happened by next week. However, what happened after that was even worse. The local newspaper did an interview with the murderer, and she told the reporters it was not her fault, and she's not sorry. Her reasoning was, "I was not myself, I was drunk." We had a customer at my old job who would come through the drive-thru all the time with her husband and cats. The cats were adorable, and they seemed happy. We all knew she had been convicted of some sort of fraud in the past, so we knew and warned him that she had just married him for his money. He was old and rich. We all just assumed she'd wait for him to die to inherit his money. I quit that job, and about a year later an old coworker reached out to me with a link to a news story. She apparently didn't want to wait for him to die. She and a man apparently killed him and beheaded him in the same van that they always drove around with their cats and dumped his body. The cops still haven't found his head. Not my story, but I remember my mother telling me this. We lived in a small cul-de-sac back in 2012. I wasn't home at the time, unfortunately my brother was though, but he didn't see anything. There was a woman who lived across from us, and her ex-husband had come over to the house and shot her. My stepdad had heard arguing and then gunshots. He said he opened the window to see the man fleeing. My mother had called 911. My stepdad ran outside to see if the woman was okay, only to find her slumped up dead in her home. He ended up having to testify in court over what he saw that day. It was really sad. The ex-husband took a mom away from her 2 kids together, a father in prison and a mother who's deceased. The situation has always been stuck in my mind, even though I wasn't home at that day. Edit. Another thing that happened as well back in 2018, this man and his son moved into our condo complex next door to us, after the man had recently separated from his wife. The son was around 17 or 18, I'd say. I didn't know the son very well, more like acquaintances. Occasionally in passing, we'd say hi to each other and go about our business. One day, I had found out the son killed himself. From hearing what happened, he had been tied up in some drug dealing and just messy drug shit. Apparently he had a warrant out for his arrest, and cops were looking for him. He drove to a Publix that was next to my complex. and he had shot an off-duty officer who was grabbing lunch, and then turned the gun on himself and he died. The officer lived, but rushed to critical. After that, I barely ever saw the father, and when I did, he looked so miserable and depressed. As a mom myself, I can't imagine losing a child in a horrible way like that. My grandmother told me about how her mother survived the Ustash reign in Croatia. When she was 15 in 1935, a group of militiamen connected with the Ustasa just started shooting people in the Jewish neighborhood of my city she lived in. She and her younger sister, who had been walking home from school, ran off the road and into a forested area. A man with a gun followed them and told her sister, who was 12, to take off her clothes once he cornered them. My great-grandmother repeatedly tried to get the gun out of his hands, but also had to hold back as not to get shot. He forced her to stand back and started wrestling her sister's clothes off. She finally just tackled him. He threw her off and pulled the trigger, which did nothing. When she realized the gun was jammed, she picked up a rock, started to fully attack him. She knocked him over and hit him in the face repeatedly while her sister kicked him until he stopped moving. Her and her sister hid in the woods for 2 days until they found their father, who survived the shooting, and the three of them moved to Hungary a year later. 10 years later, she was also the only one in her family to survive the Holocaust, but she never really talked about that. Met a guy that had metal rods in his leg. One day we were outside smoking a cigarette, and it was cold, and he mentioned that when it's cold out, he can feel the metal rods inside his leg get cold before the rest of his body. I asked him what happened. He said his girlfriend was driving on the highway. He was in the passenger seat. He had a seatbelt on. She did not. Something happened and they crashed. She got ejected out of the car. He said when he woke up from the crash, he saw teeth marks on the steering wheel. Turns out, when she got ejected, her bottom teeth got caught on the steering wheel and, well, you can imagine what happened. Obviously, she's dead. While my mom was pregnant with me in 1979, she and my father kidnapped my 5-year-old half-sister from her first husband. They took her from Ohio to Texas. They were on the run with her for 10 months. During that time, I was born. Her father kept calling my aunt, my mom's sister, begging for information on where his daughter was. She told him Corpus Christi, Texas. He immediately flew out there. He checked into a cheap motel and called his wife. They prayed on the phone together, and when they finished, he looked out the window of his hotel room. My mother, holding newborn me, father, and my sister were walking past his window. They were staying at the same motel. The police were called, and my sister was returned to her father. They went to court, and no files were charged against my mother and father, but they were never allowed to see her again. Court in the late 70s, early 80s was wild. I knocked at her front door when I was 19 so I could meet her. I knew where she lived because my mother would occasionally drive me past her house to show me where my sister lived. I knew a guy who was caught with CP. The cops found it hidden under his bed after receiving an anonymous tip. He worked with children, so he instantly lost his job even before any investigation. He killed himself shortly after the material was found. After he died, his young son came forward to admit he had framed his father and put the pictures under his bed and called the police himself because he was mad at him. The dad was innocent the whole time. I want to add so much more to explain how great this guy was. The story should be on the news to clear his name. Everyone should know he was framed, but that would ruin his son's life, and it's really only his story to tell. I'm an eye doctor, and I had a patient come to me with an infected eyelid. 2 other eye doctors tried to treat and failed. They were dumping all sorts of medicine into it, and it wasn't getting any better. At this point, it was swollen and painful for weeks with no improvement, despite being on tons of meds. Apparently, neither of them thought to flip the lid upside down. You know, that gross trick some kids do with their upper eyelids. It was a painful maneuver for her very swollen eyelid, which might explain it. Anywho, there appeared to be what looked like a visible abscess inside the tissue with thick, gooey material. I thought I'd give it a nudge and saw it move. This wasn't an abscess. It was something else. I managed to remove it quite easily in one whole piece. It was a fly larva. The patient told me that she had managed to remove quite a bit easily. A bug hit her in the eye a few days before she got this infection. I removed the larva, and within 2 days, the wound closed and she was 100% recovered on basic antibiotic eye drops. Yes, I do have the photos from this case, for those interested. TL, DR. Patient had a bug-laying egg in her eyelid, and I removed the larva. My good friend took her life a few years ago after a long battle with mental illness. We were in the army together. She had been divorced for a while and had been sharing custody of her 2 sons pretty amicably with her former husband. On the night she took her life, her kids had left with their dad for the weekend a few hours before. It was a Friday night, and they were due back on Sunday. They ended up staying with him for an extra night due to things running a little bit over. The dad texted my friend to let her know he'd take them to school on Monday, and they would have to take the bus home after school. When they got home 3 days after she died, her children found the body. They've been traumatized ever since. We believe to this day that she had planned on the dad finding her, and not her children, because he always brought them into the house after bringing them home. This has stuck with me for years, and I think about them often. My colleague once told me his dad ran away with another woman, leaving him and his mother when he was a toddler. His mom remarried and had another child. His mother treated both of the kids very differently. She would take them to restaurants and only order food for herself and the younger kid, while my colleague would just sit and watch them eat. His mother would take the kids shopping, but only buy stuff, toys and such for the younger one. He said it was her way of taking revenge. She never hit him, but the psychological torture continued throughout the childhood. This wife and husband were going through a nasty divorce in my area, and the wife had turned bitter and resentful because the husband was basically taking her to the cleaners, but they were splitting custody of their young daughter until the divorce was finalized. It may have been out of spite or anger, but the wife took a steak knife and slashed and stabbed that little girl and threw her in the backyard to die. A neighbor spotted the little girl and called emergency services. The little girl survived, barely. The mother, on the other hand, died in holding. A friend went out for a bike ride, and his wife decided to cut the lawn in sandals, so she managed to chop 3 toes off. No one around to help. Goes to a neighbor for help. He has dementia and just stares at her foot pumping blood. Somehow an ambulance is called and the medics go to look for the severed toes. All they find is the family dog licking its lips. Yeah. My dad and mom both worked at a lumber mill in the Rogue Valley area, Oregon during the 70s. Obviously, this mill did a number of things, such as cut and plane different types of boards, as well as making trim, etc., etc. They also had an industrial wood chipper that scrap and unusable materials. The chips went through a chute that shot outside, where there was a chip sawdust pile, essentially. One day, one of the workers who worked in the chipping area had been drinking. When he was pushing some scrap boards into it, he fell forward and was unable to get out due to being drunk, I guess. His front 2 arms made their way into the chipping blades, and he got all the way up to his elbows before another worker was able to shut the machine off. My dad was outside at the time, and he said him and about 20 other workers all watched as the chips and sawdust stopped coming out, and instead blood and small chunks of flesh, I would assume, sprayed out instead, obviously turning the chip sawdust pile into a soggy red mess. I believe he said the employee ended up bleeding to death before he could make it to the hospital. He said there was a blood stain on the floor in the wood chipping area that they could never get rid of no matter what they did for the remaining 2 to 3 years he worked there. I didn't believe this story when he told me at first, but my mom actually corroborated it too by telling me about it on another occasion when he wasn't even around from her perspective, as she was inside the building when it happened. It sounded like she was relatively close to him, but not in the exact area it happened.